Okay,
Okay, welcome, Brooke.
thank you. Hi, my name is Brooke Size. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor and a functional medicine practitioner. I have a private practice in Prairie Village, just around 80th and State Line Road in the Kansas side, obviously, in Prairie Village. I see people for individual and couples somatic therapy or counseling, and also have a functional nutrition practice. Work with a lot of people with different things. Probably the majority are gut issues or hormone issue related. And I love teaching and doing education around lots of topics that fall under all of those umbrellas. And so today we'll be talking about gluten, which has been, out there as a bit more of an understanding, I think, over the last 10 years, but is still a lot of confusion around, should I eat gluten? Should I not eat gluten? What are some of the issues? How would I know that gluten is bothering me? So we're going to dig into all of that and just discuss some of the way, the physiology around how gluten is digested in the body, how it impacts the body, what is celiac, non-celiac, gluten sensitivity, what are those? What else? How might gluten impact the body? And then we'll get into how would you eat gluten free? Like, what is gluten in? What things don't have gluten, and go from there. So we'll dive in. What is gluten and where is it found? So gluten is a protein, and gluten is also gliadin is a gluten protein. And when we break down the gluten protein, there are all of these peptides and that make up that protein. And so I'll talk more about testing a little bit later, but we can actually test if we're having a response to any of those peptides that are in that gluten protein. So just know, I mean, just like any other protein, it's made up of smaller compounds that make up that protein. Gluten is the same way. It is found in grains, particularly wheat, barley, and rye. And the most commonly eaten one is wheat, because most of our breads and pastas and cereals and stuff like that are made from wheat, but you might find it in, like rye bread or um, some other whole grains. So you can see here common sources: bread, pasta, cereal. I mentioned anything that's made from wheat flour, cakes, cookies. You can pretty much assume if you walk into like a coffee shop and you order a baked good that it has wheat, that it has gluten, unless it says gluten free. And we'll talk about, avoiding gluten in a little bit, because there's different levels of gluten avoidance depending on what's going on for someone. So anything with flour, couscous has wheat. Interestingly, if you go to sushi, so gluten is the protein and mostly what we're talking about today. Some people are allergic or sensitive to wheat starch, is also a problem. That would be the carbohydrate compound that's in wheat. And if somebody is sensitive to wheat overall and not just the gluten protein, it can be confusing. Like, I'm sensitive to that, and I would always react after eating sushi. And I'd make sure I had tamari, which is gluten free, as opposed to soy sauce, which usually has gluten. So I was always like, why do I react after going and eating, gluten free rolls? Well, California rolls that have the fake crab, that has wheat starch in it. So sometimes there's little things that we don't quite realize. So I'll try to throw in as much of that as I can today as we're talking. So wheat starch is separate from gluten, but so a lot of people that have a gluten sensitivity also just have an overall wheat sensitivity and don't do well with the starch either. So that's quite possible. Barley, malt that's used in beer brewing. So beer usually has wheat unless it is like made from sorghum or something else that doesn't have gluten. Barley malt extract is sometimes in condiments, so we want to look for that if you're avoiding gluten. Barley flour, barley-based cereals. Same thing here with rye. There's rye crackers, rye bread, rye flour. You might find it in cereal. And then oats are confusing for folks. Sometimes gluten can be in there's cross-contamination because there are a lot of places where wheat is processed, oats are processed. So if somebody's very sensitive, then oats might be a problem. And this is why when you're shopping, you might see oats that say gluten-free and oats that don't. By nature, oats are gluten-free. It's just that they're often processed in a place with wheat, and so there's a cross-contamination issue. So why is gluten in so many foods? Often I hear when somebody says, "Oh, I don't know, like I don't know about trying to avoid gluten," or like, "I don't even know if I want to get tested to see if it's an issue because what if then I have to stay off of it because it's in so many things." Part of the reason for that is that in baked goods, breads, flour, pasta, it provides elasticity and texture. It adds elasticity to dough. It allows it to stretch and rise during baking. That can contribute to a certain desired texture in the bread, the pasta, or the baked good, which is why it's a little bit of an adjustment when you start eating gluten free. We've gotten a lot better than like 5 or 10 years ago at making bread and things like that are gluten free and having it still maintain a lot of the texture or qualities of the gluten containing item. But there is a difference. Oftentimes the bread falls apart a little bit easier. It doesn't quite have the same elasticity to it. Gluten acts as a binding agent, holding the ingredients together in various food products. It can help stabilize mixtures, prevent crumbling, ensure a cohesive texture. It is also a leavening agent. And so it can trap gas, like in a baked good when it's cooking, traps gas bubbles produced by yeast or other leavening agents. And so there's a purpose to it in the baking process. And that will result in a light, airy texture in the bread or the baked good. It also adds flavor and appearance, kind of a characteristic taste to bread made from wheat, and also gives like this golden brown crust and a desirable crumb structure. So that is what it is used for and why it's in so many things. And it does do a good job of those things. Oh, it's also versatile. Um, we use it in a lot of different types of products, and it's relatively inexpensive compared to other protein sources. And so some places will use that, to put into the food for that reason. Okay, so let's get into what happens when we're digesting gluten. And this is really going to speak to a lot of like starting to answer the question, why is it such a big deal? Like, why do so many people seem sensitive to gluten? Why is there this whole big, there's gluten free products on aisles and there's so many people doing it? So when we eat something with gluten, this is true for everybody, whether we have any sort of reaction to gluten or not. Gluten stimulates a protein in the body called zonulin. And zonulin is a protein in our body that modulates the permeability of tight junctions in the gut. So, what that means is like if my fingers are the gut cells, right? And in between these gut cells, there's these little things called tight junctions that hold it tight together. And we want that to stay tight because as we eat food and it goes into the gut, if this is tight and there's, the good protection to the lining, then we only are going to absorb through that intestinal layer, the fully broken down amino acids or vitamins or nutrients that we need to take into the body. If we're a little bit, there's permeability or what's referred to as leaky gut, then there can be proteins that aren't fully broken down or pieces of food that aren't fully broken down. And these little bits of food particles can slip into the bloodstream. That then can lead to our immune system identifying that there's like, oh, this little protein of carrot in the bloodstream and it shouldn't be there. So then we get this immune reaction to carrots potentially and inflammation and some like low level inflammation happening there. And so we don't want that. That's kind of if that's happening over years and the immune system's getting dysregulated and we're having this kind of dysfunction in the gut, that is what can lead to autoimmune diseases. It can be prevalent with digestive disorders. It can play into allergies or other immune dysregulation. And so we really want that lining in the gut to be nice and stable and strong and not permeable. Zonulin does cause those tight junctions to open, and gliadin, which is, I mentioned, a component of gluten, can trigger the release of zonulin, causing those tight junctions to open. And then if they, for some people who have really stable immune system, balanced immune system, good digestion, there's an opening and then they close again. And they might not, that person may not have any sort of like immune reaction to gluten. They're doing okay and they don't notice symptoms to it. Is it more inflammatory than eating leafy greens? Definitely. Is that person having an obvious reaction to it? No. What we would look for to see, so then I should say somebody else whose immune system is maybe like a little bit more imbalanced, whatever slips out into the bloodstream is going to cause like maybe more inflammation, and then that person has symptoms to it. Whereas the other person, their inflammatory levels are low, their body's doing pretty well, and they just kind of deal with that extra process that happens when we eat gluten. If so, I'll mention a little bit on testing here. I think I have some of it on a future slide, but what we look for, there are some other things called actin, um, few other things that on a test, there's a test called the wheat zoomer test. And that is the only one I ever use to test for gluten sensitivity because it looks at like every peptide that's in wheat, including gluten, gliadin, wheat starch, to see if the body has made antibodies against it. Because what that tells us is that, okay, this has both in the gut and maybe outside of the gut, the immune system is like upregulated against it. Our immune system is fighting this protein and doesn't like it. And it also looks to see if there are antibodies against actin or zonulin, anti-zonulin antibodies. And so that also says like zonulin levels are up. The body is now made antibodies against this protein in the body because it's kind of high. And this whole process is like the body's kind of fighting the process of digesting gluten. It doesn't like it. Our immune system's upregulated. So every time we eat it, there's more inflammation happening in the body. And that's when that's a good way to identify if wheat is a problem. What I will say right now is that it is really hard. It is one of the hardest things I find in practice to identify as an issue compared to other foods. Dairy seems much more easier to food challenge. So I'll explain. What I mean by this is that we can do an elimination of a food. If we want to test out and see if it's a problem for the body, we can take that food out for 2 weeks, give the body a break from it, and then we eat 3 servings of that food in a day. And we wait 2 days without eating it and just see if we have any reaction that day or any reaction in the 2 days following. And those reactions to food sensitivities could look like a digestive response, like maybe we get constipation or a loose stool or a stomach ache, we get reflux or heartburn, bloating. It might be respiratory. Maybe we get a stuffy nose the next day. We wake up with a stuffy nose, or we have our eyes start watering, right? Or something like that. It could be skin related. And gluten is very common with eczema. I see that often with skin issues. We're going to talk about a specific skin issue caused by gluten, but eczema can be related to many things, but gluten is one of them. And it's really tricky. I will share that years back, I had a 6-year-old who had eczema from the time she was a baby. And it was like head to toe eczema, really, really, really bad. She had already tried removing gluten for 1 month and it didn't go away. And that was probably when she was like 2. And so her mom figured, well, gluten's not the problem. They tried every tincture, every herbal, every topical. And at 6, she still had eczema head to toe. So when we talked, I said, you might need to avoid it for more like 4 to 6 months to really see, because it's not direct, right? It's not gluten specifically on the skin causing eczema. It's by way of what we're seeing here. It's by way of the gut. And then there's an inflammatory response that's impacting the skin, and that's the symptom we're getting. So to clear that up, we kind of have to like take it out, and then we got to let the gut heal a little bit. We have to work on gut health and then see if it gets better. And if in 6 months or so it doesn't, well, we can rule that out. At the time, we didn't do any sort of lab test. It was just, let's just eliminate it. She was at the end of her rope. Her daughter's been itching for 6 years. So she just took it out. It took 4.5 months before it started to clear up. And then in about 6.5 months or so, she was almost free of eczema. And so tell that story to say that if there's one thing that you test, food sensitivity testing is not black and white. And it's sometimes we need the elimination of the item and then the food challenge. Sometimes testing it is helpful. But with gluten, I would say you really have to do a long elimination to really identify, or do a lab test. And the Wheat Zoomer by Vibrant Wellness is the one that I would suggest if you ever do that. You have to get that through an integrative functional medicine provider. I do that in practice. So someone that does do integrative lab tests is how you would get that lab test. Let me see if there was anything else I was going to say there. Yeah. So impacts of gluten on health, we'll talk more about. I mentioned skin. The most obvious one that is very recognized by the medical community, although I don't know that it's always the first thing that's thought of for different issues that people are having, like stomach aches or diarrhea or things like that. But it should be tested for if we have kind of some chronic digestive issues going on, is celiac disease. That can be tested through a GI doctor. That is an autoimmune disease of the gut, and it's triggered by the ingestion of gluten in genetically predisposed individuals. So the testing for that both looks at genetic predisposition and also, is that actively happening in the gut? And usually there is a scope done to see how much damage, if there's actually been changes to the lining of the gut. And if so, there's a positive diagnosis with all those factors. It causes inflammation and damage to the lining of the small intestine. It leads to nutrient malabsorption. So I've had folks also not realize there's something called silent celiac, which means that there's no digestive symptoms. So someone thinks their digestion is fine, but they might start having nerve pain, like buzzing in their hands or peripheral nerve pain. And what's happened is there's been damage to the gut. They're not absorbing their B12, B vitamins. Their nerves are starting to get affected. And so I say that to say, that gut health, we can go back to Hippocrates said, gut health is the root of all disease. And it's always really important to think about gut health with anything that you're dealing with or just for overall health. And there are some things where, you would think that you would know that there's a gut issue, but sometimes that's not the way it presents. And there's other symptoms going on, even though digestion seems fine. So always good to check it out. Usually though, with celiac disease, there's diarrhea, there's abdominal pain, bloating, fatigue, anemia, and sometimes weight loss. Then we have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This is not an autoimmune disorder, but individuals will experience adverse symptoms in response to gluten ingestion. And again, like I mentioned, it's a little bit tricky to identify. I would say if we take two common sensitivities, gluten and dairy, dairy tends to be easier to identify. If we pull that out for 2 weeks and then we put it in and eat 3 servings in a day and wait a couple days, usually there's symptoms. Not always, but typically there's something. Whereas gluten, sometimes there's nothing. And then we end up doing a Wheat Zoomer test and there's really high reactivity to it. So it's just a little trickier to identify. If there are symptoms, they may include digestive issues like bloating, gas, diarrhea, common with IBS to have a sensitivity to gluten, headaches. That was one I had, is headaches and joint pain and back pain. I will tell you that I used to have this back pain it felt like I would ask my mom. I had it up through my 20s. And I remember in high school, I'd ask could you rub? I would get headaches. And I also had this pain that was like not even muscular. It felt deep, like nobody could get to it. I'd say rub my back and it felt like you just couldn't get to it. It was basically deep inflammation in my body that I felt in my back. And now that's what happens if I get exposed to gluten is I'll have like 3 or 4 days of back pain. But if I'm not eating it, that is gone. So uh there can be kind of odd symptoms that you might not relate to a typical reaction to gluten. Uh, Brain fog is another one, just fatigue and brain fog. And so if those are present, might be worth thinking about is could this be a problem for me? Okay. Dermatitis herpetiformis is a skin manifestation of celiac disease. It often happens with celiac disease and it's characterized by itchy, blistering skin rash. It is a direct immune reaction to gluten that results in inflammation in the skin. Obviously, treatment is adherence to a strict gluten-free diet and sometimes medication. And there are other gluten tends to I would say skin rashes and things like that are something I more commonly see with gluten, like with dairy. Things like asthma, respiratory stuff, sinus infections are just a common sign that someone might be sensitive to dairy or a common manifestation of dairy sensitivity, I should say. Common symptoms of gluten sensitivity do seem to be skin things a lot. Um, and of course, digestive. And then I would say the third would be like just overall immune inflammation type of problems or body aches and pains. Neurological disorders. Some individuals with gluten related disorders experience neurological symptoms. So we talked about the brain fog and the fatigue. Uh, there can be neuropathy and things that affect the nervous system like that. Prolonged exposure to gluten in individuals with celiac disease can lead to bone density loss and osteoporosis, and that's because of the lack of nutrient absorption. It's negative. It's really hurting our ability to absorb the nutrition that we're eating. So want to be aware of that. Systemic inflammation, we've talked mostly about that, but that just remembering that if we're eating or we're doing something on a daily basis that's increasing our inflammation, that is at the root of all chronic disease, right? Chronic inflammation is something we want to be aware of. Magda and I were just talking about doing a class next summer on inflammation. So we'll talk more about that. But anything we can do with our foods, our lifestyle, reducing stress, reducing sugar, anything we can do to reduce inflammation and keep it at a healthy level is good because that will prevent or reduce us from dealing with other sort of chronic illnesses potentially. I think I said enough about celiac disease. And non-celiac gluten sensitivity, I think we touched on all these points. This is the one that most people are more curious about. And just to name that it is often not really recognized by the conventional medical community. It is sometimes my MD is gluten-free and her whole family is because they're sensitive to gluten. So sometimes it's something that you can talk to your physician about. And sometimes it's something that isn't entirely recognized or part of school, part of med school. And so I just want to say that because sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating if you have identified that it's an issue for you and it may or may not be something you can get support from with a physician in terms of what to do about it. And so that may be where you want to reach out to a dietitian to talk about it or a nutritionist and get a little bit of extra support on how to navigate eating gluten free. I think more and more, even if it's not understood, it's at least sort of known about. And you all can weigh in if you've dealt with this. But I always just hear mixed stories of how that goes in terms of other medical visits. So the benefits of a gluten-free food plan obviously improve digestive health for those with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. We may get, some relief from other symptoms like bloating, gas, fatigue, brain fog. It can encourage healthier eating habits also by focusing on whole, unprocessed foods, and oftentimes just by nature of eating gluten free. If we're focusing on whole foods, it reduces refined carbs that don't necessarily have a lot of nutrient density to them, and it increases our nutrition overall. This is not always the case. We're going to talk about eating gluten free because it is also easy to say, okay, I'm going to avoid gluten and then go to the store and buy all the processed foods gluten free. And that isn't going to really help overall health. It might reduce reactions if one's like really sensitive or has celiac disease. It's definitely important to do, but we really want to focus on whole foods. Challenges of a gluten-free food plan. So if you eat out or you're traveling, it can be tough because there's limited food options. When you're out and about, so many restaurants have gluten-free menus now, and so many stores have gluten-free options. There's a few different things to think about if you're out and you're looking for gluten-free foods. If you have celiac, you want to look for certified gluten-free. You want to look on the product that it is actually in processed or packaged somewhere that does do certified gluten-free, meaning they're being very careful to make sure there's no cross-contamination of other products being processed in that same facility. Because with celiac, like I had a roommate in college who had celiac disease, and I remember she would, if she was having a drink, she would have potato vodka, and somebody had regular vodka and it spilled, at a party, and her wrist touched it on the counter, and she had like hives everywhere just from touching it. So you can imagine how her reaction would have been if she drank that or ate a food that had wheat. Really super reactive, and it can cause a lot of damage in the gut. So for those folks, it's really important to make sure that there's no cross contamination, that they're really having certified gluten free foods. And if that is the case, eating out can be kind of tough. I'm not going to like sugarcoat that one. That can be a little bit hard. If you're just avoiding gluten and you're sensitive, and it kind of depends on the degree of sensitivity. Some folks, if they had like trace mounts, wouldn't really notice it. It's really if they're like eating a food that has gluten in it. And if that's you, then you can typically just eat from a gluten-free menu, let the server know that you're gluten-free, and make sure that there's nothing on the plate that has gluten. And if there's some sort of like, oh, it touched something else with gluten, might be okay. But want to be careful about that if you're really sensitive or have celiac disease. So I would say in the non-celiac gluten sensitivity area, it's a bit easier to eat out and do that kind of thing. If you're somewhere where it's pizza or it's just sandwiches, that's where it gets tough, right? Because usually if you can get a salad or you can get protein and veggies, then you'll be all right. Gluten-free products may be more expensive and less nutritious. So this is as I mentioned, the thing that I would see happen at first is I'm going to avoid gluten, and somebody goes out and they buy gluten-free bread and gluten-free crackers and gluten-free muffins and gluten-free pasta and all of the refined flour foods, which actually tend to have less nutrition than their gluten containing uh, alternatives, because they might just be like white rice and there's not even as much protein in that food, or less fiber. So this is the pitfall of gluten-free, would be all the gluten-free products out on the shelf that are really just processed food. Totally fine to, I love like charcuterie, like eating like some hummus and some veggies and some charcuterie meats, and maybe a little bit of like, I can't do dairy, but I can do sheep or goat cheese if I have just a little bit. That's when I'll get some gluten-free crackers, right? Or a piece of gluten-free bread to enjoy if I do something like that. But then the rest of the time, aiming for whole grains like brown rice, quinoa, or using things like sweet potatoes. Those are going to be, and I'll get into this in a slide on like what are the gluten-free grains and foods. But the point here is to avoid all of those processed food products and stick more to whole foods. If we're not planning properly and we're kind of just eating gluten free, but not getting nutritious foods in as a replacement, there is a risk of nutrient deficiencies. So we want to make sure we're, again, eating a well rounded meal. And we'll get into that in a moment. Some people react to cross reactive foods. So there are lab tests that actually do look at cross reactive foods to gluten if somebody has a lot of symptoms and they're really sensitive and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And those include corn, soy, milk, eggs, yeast, coffee, sesame chocolate, sometimes oats. Usually, when we're looking at a list of cross reactive foods, there are some that I didn't put on here that might be. It's just that the protein in that food might have some similar structure to gluten. And our immune system, if it gets a little bit confused, can react to that other food because we're already reacting to gluten. So it's like, let's just make sure we're taking care of everything. And so it makes antibodies against that other food also. This is essentially what research seems to be happening with autoimmune thyroid and gluten is that the body starts reacting to gluten. And because of the structure of thyroid, the proteins in the thyroid, that it starts reacting to self tissue also. And there's some confusion in the immune system. I'm really like putting this in layman's terms, but the takeaway is that if you have Hashimoto's, it is recommended from a holistic nutrition functional medicine perspective to avoid gluten because there can be some worsening or potential immune system upregulation against the thyroid if that's already present with eating gluten. And we want to calm down that inflammatory process and get the immune system really regulated. It's always something you can go in and test, but that's one health condition that there's like a high recommendation to avoid gluten and gliadin is Hashimoto's thyroid disease. Okay, it's more tips for eating gluten free. Reading food labels carefully to identify gluten containing ingredients is really important. And then it gets into, okay, what am I looking for with gluten containing ingredients? Because it can get pretty confusing. I can point you towards natural grocers. If you go in and ask, they have some really good lists for shopping that tell you like everything that you would be everything that you might see on an ingredient label that's gluten containing. So I'm going to run through some just to kind of get in your head what some of these words are. Barley, caramel color. So caramel color rarely contains gluten in the US, but it can. So if you see caramel color, you might want to check that it says gluten-free somewhere on the product, or you may want to look at the company's website and see, if it doesn't say gluten-free anywhere, then it's probably a phone call to the company if it's something you really want to use. Good chance though if it's in the US and it's a US product that it doesn't have gluten if it's caramel color, but just something to be aware of. It can be an issue. Yeah.
Talking about US, my dietitian told me to try to eat pasta and bread in Europe because they don't have such genetically modified flour, and it doesn't work for me. I can eat without reaction maybe once a month gluten. And also she said there is a long fermentation bread in it, like I think Black Dog has that,
Mm,
and it's also like people who have gluten sensitivity, sometimes they can manage it, not me. And also these gluten-free products, they for some reason they don't work for me either, because they have xanthan gum, the binders, the leavens, or however is it called, to make the bread, as you said, fluffy. And
mhm.
so it even makes me more sick than gluten products. So because of the chemicals in it, I think it has more chemicals than, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's something people may not be interested in knowing too.
Yeah. 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 Thanks for throwing that in because I didn't have sourdough and some of those in the slides. So like sourdough bread is a good example that it is fermented. It's a fermented bread. It does have wheat and gluten, but there are people that do better with something like that or a sprouted grain bread. I would say if someone is like what you're saying, Magda, if you're definitely gluten sensitive, probably not really going to be able to eat those things very often. I have people come off of them if we get the lab test back and their reaction is high. But it could be over the long run something that you found like you could eat it once a month, or you could try, see if you're able to like once in a while have it. And then what Magda's saying about traveling over, especially in Europe, is that it's not allowed to grow genetically modified vegetables the way we are here, or produce. And so, or grains. And so the wheat is, because of that, it is different. There's a different amount of gluten and gliadin in that food product. And a lot of people, I hear that all the time. Like people come back from a trip to Italy and say, like, I was able to eat the pasta and I was okay. And I always wonder, like, if they were working there, even though Italy does have 13th month, I think, right? And they get like more time off work than we do here. Um, but if they were under the same amount of stress that they are in life here, would they be able to do it or not? Like, is it because it was vacation and they're super relaxed in their nervous system? And it's probably also that the wheat is different. And so how often one could eat it, you just have to test that out over time. Um, Einkorn, I think is what it's called, is like imported. That should be, I saw that at Natural Grocers. I actually took a picture of it the other day. See if I can look at it really quick. But that is a flour that Einkorn, yeah, it's Einkorn, and that's a flour. Um, Only wheat, never hybridized, low gluten indexed. It's organic, it's non-GMO. I not sure if I saw where it came, product of Italy. So could potentially try to bake some bread from that, like, and see how you do with it and have that as an option once in a while.
Also, I'm sorry, I read how the gluten content in wheat is like 5 times more than it was in the 50s and 60s because of it was genetically modified to, I don't know what, but we have much more gluten in wheat than we used to have.
Yeah, yeah. It's changed over time. So with these, as we're going through like ingredients to look for with gluten, colorings is another thing. Dextrin, unless it says gluten-free on the product. Obviously, enriched flour, wheat flour. You also might see hydrolyzed wheat protein or hydrolyzed vegetable protein that can have gluten. Malt, you see malt, like malt flavoring or malt syrup. Also modified food starch, monoglycerides. That one will be hard to remember. MSG, if there's foreign sources that might contain gluten. So you might check if you're eating Asian food. If there's MSG, it's not the only thing that has MSG added, but it can be commonly added. And a lot of places don't use it anymore due to people's reactions to it. If something says natural flavorings, it has to say contains barley now, which will let you know that it has gluten. And so you're looking for natural flavorings with barley would have gluten. Rice syrup actually contains barley enzymes. So if somebody's really sensitive, they might want to avoid rice syrup. And then always checking, like if you get a mixed spice, sometimes there's dextrin or there's something else added to that. So I would check those like mixed spices used for meats and chicken and stuff like that. Soy sauce is another one. Any sort of like starch or stabilizer used in baking, want to check that. Um, Alcohol, like there are some whiskey, gin. Usually those are pretty safe for gluten sensitive individuals, but somebody that's really sensitive or celiac is going to want to avoid those. Beer, malted milk. There's a lot of candies that use things. So just kind of look for that. Kind of throws out that there are a lot of other words, is the takeaway. I know you're not going to remember all of those, but if you want that list, Natural Grocers has a really good list to help with shopping. I think they actually also have a body care list that goes through all like the body care that's gluten free, because you remember that if you're really sensitive, it's in products that we put on our skin also. So we want to check on that also. So we want to check labels. We also want to choose naturally gluten-free foods like fruits, vegetables, meats, and dairy. Experiment with gluten-free grains like quinoa, rice, amaranth is another one, millet, corn, potentially, if you do okay with that. And maybe get some support, like Magda was saying, has a dietitian, getting some support to work through that. And then I threw in a little bit here to kind of talk through putting together a healthy meal, because one of the things that happens a lot, and I hear this if someone says, I'm going to do keto or low carb, and maybe that's really good because they're diabetic, or dealing with some other reason that that would be a good approach. But we don't talk about like, well, what should I eat, right? Like what is important to get in, because when we take things away, then we want to get the right stuff back in so that we're actually eating a balanced meal. So half a plate of veggies, non-starchy veggies, that is going to be anything from leafy greens to broccoli, all the cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, green cabbage, red cabbage. We got summer squash, onions, mushrooms, nightshades, root vegetables. These will be important because when we take out gluten-containing foods, we drop a lot of carbs. So we want to replace some carbohydrate, and things like sweet potatoes, parsnips, beets. We can even do like potatoes or squashes like butternut squash, kabocha squash, to get some complex carbs in our food plan. Then a palm size portion of protein, and that can be animal based, or it can be from our beans or legumes that that you might be eating. Our body doesn't store protein, so we want to get enough. We want to get some at each sitting, but eat it regularly. So that's why I say a palm size. That's usually enough for us to absorb in one sitting. And then the next time we eat, we can get a little bit more protein. Then we have healthy fats, avocado, guacamole, nuts, seeds, olives, olive oil, grass-fed butter if dairy works for you, ghee could be an option. And so we're getting some of that in. And then back on that wheel, we saw additional carbs. And that's where we're really thinking about in terms of eating gluten-free is, what am I eating instead of all those things I had before? So let's talk about that a little bit. I mentioned starchy vegetables, and like here, there can be really fun and creative ways to turn those into some of your favorites. French fries. If you get those potatoes are gluten-free, but if you're at a restaurant that fries like chicken, for example, with breading, then they're using the same oil. And so oftentimes there's cross-contamination with eating something like, oh, I know potatoes are gluten-free, so I should be able to eat fries. But if you're really sensitive, it's cooked in the same oil and you might get exposed and end up with some symptoms. And so something like that, you can purchase stuff like this at the store. It usually doesn't have the greatest oil and all of that. So if you make it at home, you can chop them up like fries and then use coconut oil or olive oil on the potatoes, some sea salt, and roast them in the oven. I like probably twice a year, my brother will get lard that he has, what is the word I'm looking for? Basically taken from cuts of meat that he has. And he'll make fries at home and he'll do it outside. And it's a little bit of a, obviously like a high fat option, but they're made in the healthiest way possible and they're gluten free. So you can make stuff, fry something at home once in a while if you really want that taste. But just know that if you're eating out, which is the normal place we get those things, you might have a exposure if you're trying to avoid gluten. Lots of ways to prepare starchy veggies, though. I like mine roasted. That's probably my favorite way, but you can do all kinds of different things. Fruits are going to give you some carbohydrates and would be a good way to get some in when you're taking those other things out. Gluten-free grains are kind of your road to getting some of the baked goods that you might like. My favorite thing to do with that is to use like some of the paleo flours just for more protein and high nutrient density, which means almond flour, coconut flour, um, maybe amaranth or arrowroot, and look up some of those paleo baked good recipes and do something like that. You can also use gluten-free grains like rice, or I've used chickpea flour before. That's one to play with. What I would say is don't swap out your flour for like your favorite wheat flour recipe. Actually, if it's say it's blueberry muffins, go look for like a paleo blueberry muffin recipe or a gluten-free blueberry muffin recipe. Because if you just try to swap it out, you almost have to change the consistency of everything else that's in that recipe, or you're going to end up with something that's not the right texture or consistency as what you were trying to make. I see that happen a lot where we just like swap out one flour and it doesn't work out usually because for any of you who bake, and I'm not like a huge baker, but it's all about kind of the chemistry of what you're putting together, right? So we have to switch out a lot of things to get it right. But it's very possible you can make very delicious like blueberry muffins that are grain-free or gluten-free. And I have lots of those recipes, and there's lots of them online. I'm thinking of like paleomom.com, paleoleap.com, there's good blogs out there. So if you're looking for that, you can make some of your favorites. It's just that you usually have to make them. There are more and more. And again, I wouldn't live on these, but it is nice to be able to have like a muffin or a scone or something that was like a favorite. And so if you go to Sprouts or Natural Grocers or Whole Foods, you will find almond flour pre-made baking mixes for cakes or muffins or cookies. And that's a good option. I think it's called Capello, has like chocolate chip cookie and it's almond flour and it's already pre-made. It's in the cold area and you just take it and cut it and cook it. And it's sweetened with honey. It's all like natural ingredients. So you can have your favorites. It's just a little extra work, but you'll enjoy them for having made it intentionally for yourself, probably in a way that isn't always the same when we just grab one at the store. Legumes and lentils are also a good option for getting gluten-free carbohydrates. Always drink a lot of water. Just had to throw that in with the meal. And then we've got about 10 minutes. So I wanted to check and see if there were any questions, or I can go back and talk a little bit more about alternatives or ways to eat gluten-free, but I want to check in and see like what the questions are.
I don't see any questions. And
Okay.
I kind of made my comment during your presentation, sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. While I'm on this slide, that's my website. I have a lot of blogs there and things like that if you want to check it out and learn a little bit more about my practice. I also there's an anxiety rescue guide on there. So you can download that if you want. You'll see that link on the homepage. That has a lot of tips and more info in it.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to go backwards here. I didn't spend too much time on this. So if there aren't questions, I can share a bit more on this, which is just, I think, worth pointing out because when we talk about gluten-free, one of the benefits a lot of people get from that is weight loss, which is a common thing, that folks come looking for nutrition support for. And I think part of the reason is that it just reduces inflammation in the body. And if it improves digestion also, then naturally our metabolism works better and our body's able to function better. And then one of the symptoms people notice or the benefits is that they lose weight. And probably part of it too is that when, as I mentioned earlier, when we eat gluten free and we pull those grain products, we really reduce our carbs. And when we reduce our carbs, oftentimes we get more balanced blood sugar. And again, we might get a benefit of noticing a little bit of weight loss or being at a healthier weight. And this is a chart I've always liked that Chris Kresser put out
Mm-hmm.
on his website when people say like, there was a lot of confusion, I think, when keto gained popularity about like, how many carbs should I be eating? And so this chart is really helpful to see like, okay, very low carb is under 50 grams. That's what's considered keto. And severe blood sugar problems would be diabetes. So for diabetes, for neurological issues like Alzheimer's, epilepsy, very low carb or keto can be a great approach. It's good studies on that being a good approach.
There's a question. Usually when getting tested for gluten sensitivity, is it recommended to first talk to your provider or more to a nutritionist? Maybe
Uh,
you can talk about sometimes you have to have a doctor recommendation and some of this or most of these tests are not covered by insurance.
yeah, yeah, good point. Yeah, so if somebody is going to get tested for celiac and or SIBO, and it seems like there's some severe digestive issues going on, I would send someone to get checked out by a GI doc because they can get a lot of it covered by insurance and get tested for like ulcerative colitis or IBD or that kind of thing. For a lot of people, we're not in that area. We're not having like severe issues. It's more like a curiosity around, am I sensitive to gluten? Is it causing some of my fatigue or a little bit of my bloating, and just wanting to know. If that's the case, I would suggest a nutritionist or a functional medicine physician. So there's a lot of us, if you go to ifm.org, that's the Institute for Functional Medicine, you can look up IFM practitioners. There's a directory. I'm also happy to, I know most of the community in Kansas City, not everybody, but I know a number of people. I also do testing for this stuff. And so for that, it is, you usually want to do that. But like Magda's saying, it's not, gluten sensitivity testing is not covered by insurance. The wheat Zoomer test does look for pre-celiac, celiac, and gluten sensitivity. So it will look for everything. That test, it's around like 275 usually.
And can you order it yourself or do you have to have a physician?
I think that a lot of these tests you can order yourself online, but they're usually really marked up because it's some provider who has it on their site who has it like really marked up. So if you go to Vibrant Wellness or Vibrant America, you could see if you can like directly order it from the lab.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's more than 275, then obviously if you go to a provider, you're paying for an appointment fee. So there's that. But if you want like even one appointment fee with some support, it might end up being the same cost or less to for the lab. It's probably less through a provider because we don't usually mark it up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the option there. But yeah, I would say you're not going to be able to get that test through insurance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I must say, or if I may say this, like like where we are supposed to keep track of how many grams of what. I really have even those you input in the apps, how many calories I have a really hard time with it because if you look at a package, it tells you. But if you cook from scratch, like half a celery, 2 carrots, and half a cup of rice, it's very difficult. Like, so I kind of gave up on all of this. I kind of eyeball it.
Yes, I'm all for that. I don't have clients track very often, more than like 3 days,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it is better to get into more intuitive eating, more mindful eating. But sometimes like 3 days is good to see like what is happening, especially if someone's like potentially overeating or undereating. I actually use it more probably for undereating than anything, but to try to get that back up. But
All right. Well, I think this was wonderful. I will stop the recording now.